Can I clean your mansion for a plate of food? He was a billionaire CEO, but he couldn't say a word. Before we begin, comment below and tell us, where are you from? Which city are you watching from? And when it's over, be sure to rate this story from 0 to 10. Enjoy the story. Boston. That night, rain poured like a curtain from the sky, each drop striking the frozen pavement and rattling against the towering iron gates. Emily, in exhausted single mother clothes, drenched, clutched Rosie, her little girl, shivering in her arms. She wasn't asking for money. She wasn't pleading for pity. Only one sentence, trembling yet firm: I can clean your estate, in exchange for one hot meal for my daughter. Inside, Alexander Thorne, the wealthy CEO who had buried his heart with his only daughter 4 years earlier, stared at the security monitor, and then his gaze froze. On Rosie's tiny wrist was a small wooden bracelet, identical to the last gift he had placed in Lily's hand before she was gone. One fleeting moment, and the cold, lifeless world around him seemed to tremble. That winter in Boston was so bitterly cold, even a breath turned into a puff of white smoke. Emily's old pickup truck sat silently behind a gas station, its rusted metal roof rattling under the pounding rain like a desperate heartbeat no one could hear. Inside, she wrapped Rosie in 2 worn sweaters, holding her close to her chest, trying to keep every last trace of warmth from slipping away. It had been 3 weeks since she'd lost her job. No money, no family. Every single meal was a gamble against tomorrow. That night, she heard about a wealthy mansion in the city. Its owner, a man so cold no one dared to knock on his door. But Emily knew this was her last choice, not to beg for money, not to ask for pity. She would trade her work for a single meal for her little girl, nothing more. Clutching Rosie tight, she crossed the rain-soaked street and stood before the tall iron gates, her breath quick and uneven, her heart pounding in her chest. Inside the security room, Alexander Thorne, the CEO who had lost everything after his daughter's death, sat staring absently at the surveillance monitors. Until he saw it. On the little girl's wrist, a tiny wooden bracelet, identical to the one he'd placed in Lily's hand 4 years ago. In that instant, his breath caught. Outside, the rain kept falling, but old memories began flooding back one by one. And you? If you were in Alexander's place, would you open that gate? Leave your answer in the comments and tell me on a scale from 0 to 10 how much this story touched you once you've heard it all. Because sometimes, just one glance is enough to pull the past back into the present. Chapter 1. The Gate in the Rain. Boston's winter wind didn't just chill the skin, it cut like a blade slicing deep into the bone. Rain poured down in relentless sheets, each drop a needle stinging the face, mixing with the damp metallic scent of the darkened streets. Emily tightened the faded wool scarf around Rosie, pressing the little girl against her chest. Rosie's breathing was shallow, broken partly from the cold, partly from hunger. Emily knew every minute out here drained another piece of her daughter's strength. The streets were empty now, lit only by the sickly glow of street lamps, their light trembling in puddles rippling under the rain. The shadows of mother and child stretched long and warped across the cracked pavement. Through the bare branches of the trees, the wrought iron gates of the Thorne estate came into view. They were so tall they blotted out the mansion behind them, each glossy black bar slick with rain, cold enough to ring when touched. Emily stopped beneath the bronze plaque engraved with the name Thorne Estate. She inhaled deeply and exhaled slowly. Part of her wanted to turn back to return to the old truck behind the gas station. At least there she didn't have to stand before a gate that seemed to guard an entire world of wealth and coldness, a world she had never belonged to. But Rosie was trembling. And the last piece of bread had been eaten yesterday at noon. Emily tightened her grip on her daughter's tiny hand. Rosie's fingers were like ice. "You okay, Rosie?" The little girl gave a faint nod. Her pale blue eyes were dulled by exhaustion, and strands of thin blonde hair clung wet to her forehead. Emily reached out and pressed the intercom button. The metallic click seemed louder than her own heartbeat. Inside the mansion's security room, Alexander Thorne stood before the glowing monitors. The pale blue light sharpened the hard, tired lines of his face, He rarely bothered with visitors, his security staff usually handled them. But tonight the intercom buzzed through the thick curtain of rain, and the image that appeared on the screen made him stop. A young woman drenched to the skin, clutching a little girl wrapped in worn sweaters. They leaned into each other, trying to shield themselves from the wind. He was ready to turn away until his eyes fell on the child's wrist. A small wooden bracelet, dark round beads strung on simple thread. His chest tightened. Identical. Every bead, every tiny scratch. The same bracelet he had given Lily, his daughter, on her last birthday, 4 years ago. The same one that had been buried with her after the accident. Alexander didn't believe in coincidences, but in that moment the sound of rain outside seemed to fade, replaced by the heavy thud of his own heartbeat. Then Emily's voice crackled through the speaker, shaky but steady. "Please. I'm not asking for money. I just want to clean your house in exchange for one meal for my daughter." There was no pitiful pleading in her tone, only a desperate resolve. Alexander's hand tightened over the console. He didn't know why he did it, but his finger pressed the button to unlock the gate. The iron groaned, swinging open like a door into another world. Emily's eyes widened at the sound. She bent down, whispering to Rosie, "They're letting us in." The little girl looked up, lips tinged blue, and managed the faintest smile. They stepped through the gate, their shoes splashing on rain-slick cobblestones. A warm yellow light from the front porch spilled across the puddles, turning them into trembling mirrors. When they reached the steps, Alexander was there. Tall, broad-shouldered white shirt with the top button undone, hands in his pockets. His face was unreadable, but his gaze never left Rosie's wrist. Emily stood straight, rain dripping from her hair onto her shoulders. She didn't know him beyond the name on the gate, but she knew this was a moment that would decide everything. Alexander didn't ask questions. He just looked into her eyes, then down at Rosie. After a long silence, he gave a single, slow nod. No words. But Emily knew it wasn't a rejection. And in that instant, it felt as though another door had quietly opened, one that wasn't made of iron. A breeze swayed the porch light above them, casting soft gold across the wet steps. Emily swallowed hard, clutching Rosie as if afraid she might vanish. Alexander stepped aside, giving way without a come in or a polite smile. Just a simple gesture, but to Emily, it felt like a rare chance being handed to her. The moment she crossed the threshold, warmth rushed over her, stinging her chilled cheeks. Outside, the cold stayed trapped behind the heavy wooden door. The roar of rain became a distant hum. Inside, the only sound was the steady drip of water from their hair and clothes onto the polished floor. Alexander led them down a long hallway lined with oil paintings. Crystal chandeliers cast their shadows across the glossy wood beneath their feet. Emily kept her eyes down, afraid the contrast between this world and hers might crush her. Rosie peeked from her shoulder just long enough to glimpse a painting of a little girl in a white dress standing in a garden of flowers. At the end of the hall, Alexander opened a door to a smaller sitting room. Here he said, voice low and gravel-edged, "You can dry off. Rest for a while." Emily nodded, unable to find the words for thank you. Not long after, he returned with a small bundle. Without a word, he left it at the door and walked away, his footsteps deep on the wood. Inside the bundle, a soft sweater, warm trousers, for Rosie, thick wool socks. No note, no explanation. Emily dressed her daughter, dried her fine hair, and tucked her under the blanket. When Rosie finally curled up warm, Emily let herself breathe again. For the first time in many nights, her little girl slept without shivering. Upstairs, Alexander stood by the window, gazing toward the gate through the veil of rain. On his desk, the framed photo of Lily remained exactly where it had sat for 4 years. He picked it up, his thumb brushing over her smiling face, the wooden bracelet glinting on her small wrist. His throat tightened as the image of Rosie came back to him, same bracelet, same pale eyes lowered against the cold. He wondered, was fate trying to speak to him? Or was this just a cruel trick of memory? In the sitting room, Emily sat beside the spare bed, her eyes fixed on Rosie's face. She smoothed the little girl's cheek and whispered, "You're safe now, at least for tonight." The rain still fell outside, but here, for the first time in a long while, they were out of the storm. And upstairs, Alexander stood on the balcony looking down the hall toward the closed door. He didn't know why he had opened the gate. He disliked strangers, especially ones who disturbed the silence of his house. But that night, when he'd nodded on the porch, it wasn't just permission to step inside. It was the first time he had opened another door, one that had been locked since the day Lily was gone. And in the quiet of the Boston rain, something small, fragile, had begun. Chapter 2. The First Meal. The fireplace in the corner of the sitting room burned low, its pale golden flames dancing lazily against warm wooden walls. It wasn't enough to chase away the full bite of a Boston winter night, but compared to the storm outside, this room felt like a small pocket of heaven. Emily leaned back against the long sofa, Rosie curled tightly in her lap, her head tucked into the crook of her mother's arm. She had never set foot in a room, this grand high ceilings, arched windows draped in heavy velvet, soft Persian rugs beneath her feet. But none of it mattered. What mattered was the warmth of her daughter's small body and the steady rhythm of her breathing under Emily's protection. Out in the hallway, Alexander stood before the half-closed door. In his hands, a thick, cream-colored sweater, a pair of soft trousers, neatly folded wool socks, and a glass bottle of milk still sending up faint ribbons of steam. He had poured it himself, a simple act he hadn't done since the night Lily died. At first he had thought to ask the housekeeper, but somehow his own hands had opened the cabinet, found the clean bottle, and warmed the milk to just the right temperature. Without knocking, he set everything gently on the floor outside the door. He bowed his head, not in greeting but in a silent wish for peaceful sleep to the child inside, then walked away, his fingers brushing the banister where Lily's small hands used to grip as she ran past. Emily noticed the bundle only when she heard the faintest clink outside the door. Opening it, she found the little gift neatly arranged, the sweet scent of warm milk still lingering. Her throat tightened. The gesture carried no hint of charity, no need for explanation. It was simple, quiet, and it warmed her heart in a way she hadn't allowed herself to feel in a long time. She dressed Rosie first, smoothing her damp hair until the child drifted back into a drowsy calm. Then, holding the bottle as though it were something precious, she pressed it to her hands to feel the heat breathing in the soft, sweet smell. Rosie sat in her lap, and Emily guided the milk to her lips. The little girl pressed them together at first, then began to drink slowly, her eyes half closed. In the golden glow of the firelight, the warmth of the bottle seeped through Emily's hands into her chest, melting something frozen inside her. When the milk was nearly gone, Rosie leaned fully into her mother's embrace and sighed a soft, contented sound Emily had not heard in months. The sound of a child, warm, full, and unafraid. Emily set the bottle aside, wrapped her arms tighter around her daughter, and kissed her hair still scented with new wool. "Sleep, Rosie. I'm right here." Upstairs, Alexander stood at the balcony rail watching the room below. Through a thin gap in the curtain, he saw Emily cradling her child, a small, unbreakable shape of mother and daughter. The firelight caught her face, her closed eyes still carrying the fierce tension of someone determined to protect. Something in him ached. Memories surfaced, nights he had sat in that same chair holding Lily, while rain whispered against the porch roof, believing the world outside didn't matter compared to that moment. When Rosie slept deeply enough, Emily eased her onto a soft rug by the fire, the warmest spot in the room. She tucked a knitted blanket over her, then sat close, her gaze fixed on that small, peaceful face. For weeks, Rosie's sleep had been restless, marked by startled cries in the cold or sudden noises in the night. But now her brow was smooth, her breath steady. Emily touched her daughter's tiny hand, the softness, the warmth that made her eyes sting. Not from pity, from gratitude. She had thought this moment would never return. And you, if you saw a stranger at your door on a freezing night holding a child and asking only for a meal, would you open the door or turn away to avoid the trouble? Sometimes that decision changes more than you'll ever know. Outside, the rain had stopped, but the slow drip from the eaves still fell into the flower bed below. Alexander stepped back from the balcony and returned to his study. He tried to focus on the open stack of documents before him, but every time he lowered his pen, the image of Emily and Rosie by the fire came back so vivid it drowned out the rustle of paper. He rose, opened a desk drawer, and took out an old photograph of Lily. In it, she was in his arms, drinking from a bottle, a white smear at the corner of her mouth, her eyes bright with trust. His chest tightened, not only from the ache of loss, but from realizing it had been years since this house had held the breath of a child. Downstairs, Emily tilted her head to better see Rosie's face in sleep. The firelight painted her cheeks a soft rose. She remembered nights in the truck holding Rosie tightly to block the cold that slipped through the thin blanket. Back then, her daughter's warmth had felt fragile, easily stolen if the gas ran out or a window shattered. Tonight was different. The walls here were thick, the fire steady, the air faintly scented with fresh wool. A borrowed home, perhaps, but for now it was enough. Footsteps sounded softly across the wooden floor, and Emily looked up. Alexander stood in the doorway holding a small tray. On it, a steaming bowl of chicken and vegetable soup. "You haven't eaten," he said. Not as a question, as something he already knew. Her instinct was to refuse, but his eyes made it impossible. "Thank you," she murmured, taking the tray in both hands as if it were something precious. She set it beside Rosie, spooned a little blue gently, and touched it to her daughter's lips first. Rosie wrinkled her nose at the heat, then swallowed, her eyes brightening. "Good," she whispered. Emily smiled and offered another spoonful. With each sip, each warm breath, Emily felt as though she was mending a torn piece of memory, the kind that belonged to quiet, ordinary meals without fear of being chased back into the cold. Alexander stood silently watching them. His hand, loose in his coat pocket, curled into a faint fist. The sight warmed and hurt him all at once, reminding him of what had been lost and what might still be found. By the time the bowl was empty, Rosie was leaning into her mother, yawning. Emily laid her down and pulled the blanket up. When she looked up, Alexander was still there. "Thank you," for everything she said this time, not hiding the emotion in her voice. He gave a small nod, his eyes softer now, as though her words had pried open a thin crack in the wall he had kept around himself for 4 years. After he left, Emily lingered by Rosie's side. The little girl wasn't just sleeping deeply. There was a faint smile at her lips, as if she were dreaming of something kind. It was the first time in months Emily had seen her daughter smile in her sleep. "Maybe," she whispered, "this isn't just shelter from the rain, Rosie. Maybe it's the start of something." The next morning, winter light filtered through the thick curtains, leaving pale gold streaks across the Persian rug. Emily woke to the scent of fresh coffee from the kitchen and the faint sound of someone moving in the hall. Rosie still slept, her tiny hands clutching the blanket as if afraid to lose it. Emily slipped into the cream sweater Alexander had given her. It still held a trace of warmth and the faint scent of oak from the house itself. She stepped into the hall and froze. At the far end, Alexander stood before a tall bookshelf, coffee in one hand, slowly turning a page with the other. The morning light edged his profile, making the fine lines at the corners of his eyes more visible, not the lines of age, but of loss. He looked up and met her gaze, not assessing. Just a small nod, his way of saying, "Good morning." Breakfast was simple toast eggs and a warm glass of milk for Rosie. Emily had meant to prepare it, but Alexander had already set the tray out by the time she reached the kitchen. "Eat first," he said before leaving the room, as though to give them privacy. Emily sat with her daughter, watching Rosie sip the milk slowly, eyes half closed in contentment. Gratitude tangled with confusion in her chest. Why would a wealthy, distant man like Alexander notice such small things? When Rosie finished and wandered off to explore the sitting room, Emily washed the dishes. Alexander appeared in the doorway, arms crossed, not in judgment, but as if trying to understand something about her. "Where did you work?" before he asked evenly. "I was a nurse," she said, pausing. But things changed. He didn't ask more, but his eyes darkened slightly, as though he had just fitted another piece into the picture of her. By midday, Emily was folding blankets when Rosie came running from the back garden, a large maple leaf in her hand. "Look, Mommy," she called, hair catching the rare winter sun. Alexander followed behind, walking slowly, as if he had been out there with her for some time. She found it under the big maple, he said, his tone carrying a softness she hadn't heard before. Emily looked at her daughter, then at him, and for the first time she saw not just sadness in his eyes, but the faint glimmer of genuine joy. That evening when Rosie was tucked in, Emily sat by the fire. Alexander entered, setting a book on the table beside her. Lily loved hearing this before bed, he said. Emily laid her hand on the worn leather cover, feeling the marks of small fingers that had turned its pages many times. He said nothing more, only nodded and left the room. But she knew it wasn't just a book. It was a piece of his memory, a piece of his heart placed quietly in her hands. She sat for a long time, running her fingers over the cover, wondering which parts Lily had loved most or where she had laughed. Somehow, Emily felt that Lily and Rosie, though they had never met, were connected through a wooden bracelet, through a bedtime story, through him. The next morning, light snow fell on the porch. Emily rose early, wanting to find something useful to do before Alexander woke. In the laundry room, she found a basket of table linens and curtains waiting to be folded. A deep voice came from behind her. "You don't have to do everything today." She turned to see Alexander in the doorway, coffee in hand. His expression wasn't stern, but it held an unmistakable attentiveness. "I want to," Emily said softly, "to say thank you." He didn't answer right away, just nodded once, something in his eyes that felt like acceptance. That afternoon, while he was away for a meeting, Emily cooked a pot of chicken soup, the aroma filling the kitchen. When he returned, stepping through the door, the scent made him pause. "You cooked?" he asked. "Yes. I thought a warm meal might be good for all of us." He studied her for a moment, then sat and quietly began to eat. During the meal, Rosie tried to scoop her own soup, but spilled a little. Emily reached for a cloth, but Alexander steadied her bowl, helping her fill the spoon. "I can do it," Rosie said, "but let him help." Their eyes met his and the little girl's, and Emily could see it, a thread, fragile but strong, weaving itself between them. Later that day, Rosie played in the garden, arranging twigs into the shape of a heart. From his study window, Alexander watched. He didn't know why, but the corner of his mouth lifted into a smile he couldn't remember last wearing. That night, Emily was tidying the sitting room when Alexander set a small package on the table. Inside, a pale blue wool scarf. "It'll be cold for a while yet," he said, as if it were the most obvious thing. "You didn't have to," she began. "I know," he interrupted. "I wanted to." She sat down, holding the scarf, her eyes stinging. She couldn't remember the last time someone had given her something simply because they wanted to. He didn't stay for thanks. He left the room, taking with him a quiet warmth that lingered in her chest. That night, she read to Rosie from Lily's book, her voice gentle as the child drifted off with a faint smile. Upstairs, Alexander listened, the words carrying up the stairwell. The sound didn't just send Rosie to sleep. It carried him back to a time when Lily's laughter still filled the house. When the night grew still, Alexander stepped into the garden. The sky had cleared and a few rare stars glimmered above. He stood by the flower bed where Lily had once played and whispered, "You wouldn't believe it, Lily." But tonight I smiled. Inside, Emily pulled the blanket higher over Rosie, then leaned back in her chair, eyes closing briefly. The night she had asked only for a meal had led them here to warmth she had thought gone forever. Somewhere else in the house, Alexander knew this was no longer a story about temporary kindness. That first meal had planted a seed, one that would change him, and both of them. Chapter 3. Mr. Sad Voice. The Boston morning was crisp and cool. A thin veil of mist drifted over the lawn, and the pale sunlight spilled across blades of grass still jeweled with dew, thousands of tiny drops like glass beads. The air still carried a chill that slipped between your fingers, but the sky was clearer, and the scent of fresh grass mixed with damp earth made the morning feel lighter. Emily stood on the back porch, arms folded, watching Rosie race across the yard. The little girl's bare feet pressed into the cool grass, her golden hair flying back as she tilted her head toward the sky, laughing at the white butterflies circling her. Alexander stepped into the garden, hands in his pockets, his pace unhurried, still carrying the quiet authority of a man accustomed to making decisions. He had no intention of intruding on their morning. Truth was, he still kept a certain distance, a habit born from self-preservation. But Rosie saw him. Her blue eyes lit up, and without thinking, she ran toward him, leaving tiny wet footprints across the porch tiles. "Mr. Sad Voice," she called out, and before Alexander could react, her small arms wrapped around his leg. The warmth of her little hands went straight through the fabric of his trousers, cutting through the thin layer of frost he still kept around his heart. Alexander froze. He wasn't used to being touched, especially not by a child's hands. But this hug, it wasn't awkward, and it asked for nothing. It was pure, unconditional connection. "Mr. Sad Voice," he repeated, glancing down at her. Rosie nodded hard, revealing the gap where her left baby tooth had been. "Because your voice sounds like someone who's remembering a song." Emily hurried over her cheeks, flushing. She just says whatever comes to mind," she said quickly, her eyes carrying a quiet apology for her daughter's blunt honesty. Alexander looked at Emily, then back to Rosie. "And you think it's a sad song?" he asked softly. Rosie shook her head, frowning as if weighing her answer. "No, it's a song that's waiting for someone to sing it again." The reply left Alexander silent. He couldn't remember the last time anyone had said something that made him pause without an answer. They stood like that for a few seconds until Rosie let go and ran back to the grass to chase her butterflies. Emily pressed her lips together, ready to say something, but Alexander had already turned toward the porch. Just before stepping inside, he said quietly, without looking at her, "Children often notice what adults work very hard to ignore." The words weren't just for Rosie. They lingered in Emily, part confession, part warning. Rosie ran in loops across the lawn, her little feet leaving wet traces on the green. Emily stayed at the porch edge watching her daughter, but her mind circled back to Rosie's words, a song waiting for someone to sing again. Her daughter often said things that made grown-ups think for a long time, but this time Emily knew the words had struck something deep inside Alexander, in a place he'd kept locked. Alexander lingered on the porch for a few minutes, listening. From here he could hear Rosie's laughter, clear, untouched by any shadow of the world. That sound threaded itself into his memory, intertwining with a voice he'd tried to forget for 4 years. Lily's voice calling Daddy from a sunlit corner of the yard, a worn doll clutched in her hand. His fingers curled in his pocket, holding on to the memory before it could dissolve again. Emily called Rosie in before the morning dew could chill her. Passing Alexander, she hesitated. "Thank you for not pushing her away," she said softly. "Rosie doesn't trust easily." Alexander frowned slightly. "I don't see a reason to push her away." Then, meeting Emily's eyes, his voice deepened. "Same goes for you." Her heart skipped. She wasn't sure if she'd just been reassured or quietly read like an open book. That afternoon at lunch, Alexander sat at the long dining table, Rosie across from him, propping her chin in her hands, studying him as though he were a rare creature. Suddenly, she announced, "Your voice isn't as sad as it was this morning." Emily tensed, ready to hush her, but Alexander only gave a small, genuine smile. "Maybe because now I'm listening to a song," he said, his gaze still on Rosie. The table went still for a beat before Rosie giggled. In that sound, Emily realized a new crack had appeared in the cold wall around Alexander. Later, Rosie built a castle out of wooden blocks on the living room rug. Alexander passed by, pausing to watch. "Whose castle is this?" he asked. "Mr. Sad Voice's," she replied matter-of-factly. "But I'm building extra rooms for me and Mommy." Alexander froze for half a second. From the couch, Emily looked up from folding laundry and caught his gaze. Some things didn't need words. As dusk fell, Emily bathed Rosie while Alexander sat alone in his study, flipping open an old notebook. He wrote a single line, not business notes, but something else entirely. "A voice is less sad when it hears laughter." He set down the pen, leaning back in his chair, realizing it had been years since he'd written anything unrelated to money or contracts. That evening, Emily stepped onto the back porch for some air. Alexander joined her, a mug of tea in hand. For a few minutes, neither spoke. The only sounds were the soft wind and the scent of roses still damp with dew. Finally, Alexander said quietly, "She's not Lily, but she's like Lily." Emily waited. Like her in the way she knows how to step into someone's heart, without knocking. Do you believe some people, no matter how briefly you meet them, can touch the deepest part of your heart, the part you thought was locked away? Back inside, Emily noticed the children's book on the table. A slip of paper had been tucked inside in neat handwriting. Stories are better when read together. She smiled, a warmth spreading through her chest. Upstairs, Alexander stood on the balcony, listening to Rosie stir in her sleep. Not because he was worried, but because now he wanted to be near that sound. The next morning, Boston lay under a thicker blanket of mist. Somewhere, sparrows sang between the soft patter of dew dripping from leaves. Rosie woke first, slid out from under her blanket, and padded down the hall in loose wool socks. Near the study, she found Alexander by the tall window reading the paper. Without a word, she climbed into the chair beside him and wrapped her arms around his arm. He stiffened for a second, then let her stay, one hand resting lightly on her back. "Here to bother Mr. Sad Voice again?" he asked, his tone softer than usual. Rosie shook her tangled blonde head. "No, I came to sing to you, so you won't be sad." Before he could reply, she began a simple little tune, slightly offbeat, but clear as sunlight through fog. He sat still, listening. It wasn't a long song, just a few repeating lines. But when she finished, the hollow space in his chest felt filled with something warm and real. Emily appeared in the doorway, ready to tell Rosie to give him space, but she stopped. The early light framed them, one tall, one small, side by side, and for a moment, every gap of age and circumstance seemed to vanish. Alexander looked up and met Emily's eyes. In that moment, she knew he no longer saw her as a stranger. Something in him had softened, opened. Just enough. After breakfast, Emily cleaned the kitchen while Rosie colored at the table. Alexander set his laptop across from her, pretending to work, but glancing over whenever Rosie bent her head in concentration. "What are you looking at?" she asked suddenly without looking up. Alexander chuckled. "Just seeing how your castle's coming along. You can have a room in it too," she said. "But you have to promise not to be sad anymore." He didn't answer right away. He knew it was the hardest promise to keep, and the one most worth trying for. That afternoon, they all went into the back garden. The grass was still damp, but Rosie insisted on showing Alexander the biggest maple tree in the world. She led him to its trunk, eyes shining as though she'd found treasure. "You know," she said, "this tree has a Mr. Sad Voice too. It whispers like it's telling a sad story." Alexander tilted his head, listening to the leaves rustle in the wind. He didn't argue. For the first time, he wanted to hear the whole story. When the sun set, Emily took Rosie inside for a bath. Alexander stayed under the maple alone, replaying every word Rosie had said, every sound of her laughter, and the way Emily had looked at them. A thought flickered. If Lily had lived, would she and Rosie have played together here? The image was so beautiful it ached, and so painful it stole his breath. That night, with Rosie asleep, Emily sat reading in the living room. Alexander entered with 2 mugs of hot cocoa. "Colder tonight," he said, setting one in front of her. She cradled it in both hands, soaking in the warmth. They sat in silence for a while before he asked, "Do you think—" My voice sounded less sad today. Emily met his eyes, smiling faintly. "Yes, but there's still one low note. I don't think it will ever go away." Alexander studied her for a long moment, then nodded. "Maybe not, but someone's trying to sing with me now, and that's different." She didn't answer, but her gaze softened. They let the wind outside and the cocoa's warmth fill the space between them. When Emily went to bed, Alexander stayed looking at the empty chair across from him. The silence in the house had changed. It no longer felt hollow. It felt like the quiet before the next line of a song. Before turning in, he stepped into Rosie's room. She stirred in her sleep, still clutching the wooden bracelet. He bent down and whispered, "Good night, little girl who sang my song back to me." Closing the door, Alexander knew tomorrow he'd go to the garden again, waiting to hear her call him by that name. Not because it was true, but because for the first time in years, he wasn't afraid of anyone hearing the sadness in his voice. Chapter 4. Lily's Pillow. That morning, the Boston sky was a pale shade of gray. Weak light filtered through the tall window panes, falling in scattered patches across the polished wooden floor. Alexander had left early for a meeting, the kind of morning that left the mansion so quiet you could hear the pendulum clock ticking in the hall. Emily took advantage of the silence to sweep the upstairs corridor, the one lined with closed doors she had never touched since arriving. She had no intention of opening any that weren't on her list. But when Rosie's rubber ball rolled to the far end of the hall, it stopped right in front of a white-painted door, a door that stood slightly ajar. Emily bent to pick up the ball, and a faint breath of air escaped the crack in the door as she pushed it open. The room beyond felt as though it had been frozen in time, everything still as if asleep. Light filtered through a thin curtain dust, turning it golden as it settled over a small bed, a bookshelf, and a toy cabinet. Drawings were taped to the walls, skies, birds, and clusters of purple flowers waiting for a child to return and finish a game she'd left undone. Emily stepped inside her shoes, sinking into the thick carpet. The air smelled faintly of old fabric and a trace of vanilla. She stopped beside the small bed where a pale blue pillow rested neatly in place. In one corner, the fabric had torn open, revealing a tuft of white stuffing. For reasons she couldn't explain, the sight made her chest ache, as though the room had tried to hold on to something whole, but time had left it with a small wound. Sitting at the edge of the bed, she pulled a spool of thread and a needle from her apron pocket. Her stitches were slow, careful, each one placed with the kind of respect reserved for something deeply loved. When the final stitch was tied, Emily set the pillow back where it had been, smoothing the fabric as if coaxing it back to sleep. "It's better now," she whispered, unsure if she was speaking to the pillow or to the child who once held it. She didn't realize someone had been standing in the doorway. Alexander had come home earlier than expected. On his way upstairs to retrieve a file, he noticed the door to that room was open. He froze mid-step. He had never allowed anyone inside. For 4 years, the room had been locked, not just with a key, but with his own heart. And now from the threshold, he saw Emily at the bed, needle in hand, bent over the pillow as if tending to something fragile. "What are you doing?" His voice came sharper than he'd intended. Emily startled, the needle still between her fingers. I saw it was torn. I only meant to fix it." "I didn't. You're not supposed to be in here." He cut in, his words like a cold blade. Lowering her eyes, she set the pillow down. "I'm truly sorry. I didn't know this was a special place." Alexander stepped inside, standing near the bed. His gaze fell to the pillow, now sewn with neat, careful stitches. His hand trembled slightly as he touched it. The softness under his palm sent a sudden, powerful rush of memory through him. Lily curled against that very pillow when she had a fever. Her cheeks flushed, eyes half closed, but still smiling as he told her a story. His breath caught. For the first time in 4 years, Alexander didn't stop the tears. They came silently falling onto the fabric. Emily stood still, uncertain whether to step closer or retreat. But when she saw the quiet tremor in his broad shoulders, she knew this wasn't the moment to walk away. She moved closer, not touching him, only standing beside him, offering her presence as a silent reminder that he wasn't alone in his grief. Without looking at her, his voice was low and raw. "I wasn't there when she needed me most." Silence lingered, only the ticking clock and the faint rustle of leaves outside the window. At last, Alexander placed the pillow back down and drew in a long breath. "Thank you for mending it," he said, his tone deeper now but warmer. Emily nodded, her own eyes blurring. "Some things can't be sewn back together, but we can keep them from tearing any further." Have you ever stumbled across someone's deepest wound by accident, and instead of making them angry, helped them open it just enough to begin healing? Would you stay, or would you walk away to avoid the pain? When Alexander left the room, his steps were slow, as though each one carried the weight of years. Emily stood a moment longer before gently closing the door this time, without locking it. She didn't know if she'd done right or wrong, but at least the pillow's tear was gone. Downstairs, Rosie was bent over a puzzle. She looked up, her blue eyes bright. "Where'd you go, Mommy?" Emily smiled, settling beside her. "Just to fix something important." Upstairs, Alexander returned to his study. Instead of opening the file on his desk, he pulled a small wooden box from a drawer. Inside lay a few of Lily's things: a butterfly hair clip, a pair of tiny canvas shoes, and a hand-drawn birthday card. His fingers lingered on the card, tracing the messy crayon letters, "Daddy is my hero." The words pierced through the steel wall he had built around his heart. That afternoon, Emily left a basket of clean laundry at the study door. Alexander opened it, looked down at the basket, then at her. They stood without speaking for a long moment before he said quietly, "You did a fine job sewing." Emily understood he wasn't only talking about the pillow. In some way, he was acknowledging that she'd sewn together a piece of memory he had thought too painful to touch again. At dinner, the atmosphere was different. Alexander didn't sink into his usual silence. He asked Rosie about her puzzle, listened to every detail, even laughed once or twice. Emily watched a warmth and unease mingling in her chest. She knew she had touched a part of him he thought was gone. After dinner, Rosie appeared with a picture book. "Read to me," she asked. Alexander hesitated, then nodded. He sat on the couch, Rosie tucked into his side, her head resting against his arm. His voice was still deep, but the heavy note she'd heard before was lighter now. From the kitchen table, Emily listened as each sentence carried softly through the room, as if the house itself was breathing easier. When the story ended, Rosie tilted her head up. "Do you miss someone?" Alexander nodded slowly. "Yes, very much. I think they'd be happy to see you smile." The simple words made him swallow hard. Emily noticed the way his hand gently squeezed Rosie's shoulder, a thank you without sound. That night, after Rosie was asleep, Emily came back to find Alexander by the fireplace, a glass of wine in hand, eyes on the flames. He didn't turn when he heard her step, but his voice carried low. "Today, I cried for the first time in 4 years." She stayed quiet, letting him continue. "It's strange. I thought I'd hate it, but it was lighter than I expected." Have you ever held back tears for years, only to let them fall one day over something small, something you thought was meaningless, and found yourself breathing easier afterward? Alexander set his glass down and turned toward her. "Thank you for mending the pillow, and for not walking away when you saw me at my weakest." Emily's smile was faint but warm. Sometimes, mending one small thing can save an entire heart. For a few moments they stood in silence, both understanding they had crossed an important line. When Emily returned to her room, Alexander remained by the fire. He knew now the door to Lily's room would never stay locked forever, not because he was ready to forget, but because someone had found a way in gently and begun stitching together what he thought could never be whole. Upstairs, Rosie shifted in her sleep, hugging her cloth doll. And downstairs, for the first time in 4 years, the fire in the hearth warmed more than just the room. Chapter 5. The night. The lights went out. The winter storms swept in faster than any weather report had warned. Wind howled against the tall windows, rain lashed in relentless sheets, and every so often lightning tore open the night sky, casting skeletal tree branches in a ghostly glow as they swayed and bent. Emily pulled the heavy curtains tighter. Rosie pressed her face to the glass, watching as if the storm were a special performance put on just for tonight. In his study, Alexander stood at his desk, eyes drawn again and again toward the living room, where mother and daughter sat together in their own small island of warmth. Then at exactly 7:08 p.m., the house plunged into darkness. A sharp click echoed, followed by the sudden hush of every machine and hum silenced at once. The wind outside roared louder now. Inside, only the steady heat of the fireplace remained, and Rosie's small voice breaking the quiet. "Mommy." The lights went to sleep. Emily chuckled softly, rubbing her daughter's back. "Then tonight," she said, "we'll have dinner by candlelight." Within minutes, the coffee table in the living room held 3 scented candles. The soft golden light flickered up to the ceiling, leaving delicate patterns that danced and swayed. Rosie sat wrapped in a quilt on the thick rug, her wide eyes reflecting every flame. Alexander entered carrying a hardbound book. He looked toward his usual armchair, but when Emily patted the empty space beside her on the rug, he hesitated, and then lowered himself to sit with them. "I want a story," Rosie said, leaning her head on her mother's shoulder. Emily's smile turned playful. "All right, I'll tell you a story about a hedgehog who wanted to fly." Rosie giggled at the title alone. Alexander tilted his head, the corner of his mouth curling not at the story, but at the sound of that laughter. Emily began. "Once upon a time, there was a little hedgehog named Spike. Spike had lots of sharp spines, but what he wanted more than anything was to fly like the birds. So one day Spike decided to make himself wings out of leaves and vines." Her voice shifted up and down, painting the scene of Spike running across the forest floor, flapping wildly, trying and failing to take off. Rosie burst into peals of laughter, toppling into her mother's lap as Emily made whooshing sounds to mimic Spike's doomed attempts. That laughter rang bright and full, spilling into every corner of the room. Alexander's fingers paused on the edge of a page. He closed his eyes for a moment. That sound was just like Lily's laugh when he used to tell her about the turtle who wanted to ride a spaceship. The way Rosie tilted her head, the way her small hand slapped her knee when she laughed, it was all an echo of another time. The ache in his chest tightened, and before he could stop it, a single warm tear slid down onto the back of his hand. Emily noticed the shift in the air. Looking up, she saw the candlelight catch in his eyes, not rigid with restraint as before, but glistening unguarded. She didn't ask. She simply kept telling the story, letting Rosie's laughter weave through the room, softening the sharp edges of his memories. When the tale ended, Rosie collapsed against her mother's lap, breathless from laughing. Alexander set the book aside, watching them for a long moment before speaking quietly, his voice low and trembling. "I'd forgotten how much laughter could fill this house." Emily's smile was tinged with sadness. Laughter is the one thing we should never let stay gone for too long. Rosie had fallen asleep right there on the rug, her small hand still clutching the corner of the quilt. Emily bent to lift her, but Alexander stepped forward, gently taking the girl into his arms as if she weighed less than a breath. Together they carried her upstairs and laid her in bed. Alexander lingered, his gaze fixed on her golden hair spilling across the pillow. For a moment he was back in a rainy night years ago, watching Lily's peaceful breathing, her little hand curled around a toy. He stepped back, but his eyes stayed on Rosie a second longer. Emily could see it. The look wasn't just affection for a child. It was the cautious opening of a heart that had been locked away too long. Back in the living room, the candles still glowed, and the fire had burned down to a bed of red embers. Emily settled onto the rug again, drawing the quilt around her shoulders. Alexander stood for a moment before taking off his jacket and sitting down beside her. Outside, the wind still hissed through the trees, but here the air was calm, only the faint pop of candle wax and the slow, steady rhythm of 2 heartbeats. "Do you always tell Rosie stories like that?" he asked, his voice deeper, now closer. Emily nodded. "I think children need another world to escape to when the real one gets too cold. Stories are like blankets, they wrap you up and keep you safe." Alexander's gaze stayed on the flickering flame. "Lily loved that too. She used to make me read the same story dozens of times." A pause, then softer. "Maybe I needed those stories as much as she did. I just didn't realize it. Emily's eyes softened. Maybe we all do. Adults are just better at pretending we don't. Her words slipped past the last of his defenses. Alexander let out a quiet laugh, not from amusement, but from the dawning truth of it. Maybe. It's time I stopped pretending. Outside, the wind began to ease, leaving only the gentle patter of rain. Alexander rose and retrieved a small wooden box from the bookshelf, placing it in front of her. Inside lay a worn-down, colored pencil, a few scraps of paper covered in messy crayon drawings, and a hair clip shaped like a flower. "Lilies?" he said simply. "I've never shown them to anyone." Emily looked at each item as though they still held the warmth of the little hand that once gripped them. She closed the box gently and pushed it back toward him. "Thank you for trusting me." Alexander didn't return it to its hiding place. He left it on the table, a quiet declaration that the past no longer had to stay locked in the dark. In the candlelight, Emily saw something new in his eyes, not just the shadow of loss, but the faint search for what might lie ahead. Near midnight, the power returned, lights flickering back to life, but neither of them moved. Alexander glanced around and smiled faintly. "I think this evening turned out better than watching the news." Emily laughed softly. She didn't disagree, because she knew the blackout had switched on something else in him. Have you ever lived through a night without power, only to realize later it was worth more than anything you could have planned? The candlelight, the stories, the laughter. Small things that reach deeper than any expensive gift. Before bed, Alexander stepped out onto the balcony, breathing in the damp post-storm air. In the quiet, Rosie's laughter replayed in his mind, bringing tears again this time, not from pain, but from gratitude. Inside, Emily drew the curtains, her eyes drifting toward the balcony. She knew. He was learning to live with a sound he'd once feared. The night without lights had ended, but the warmth it sparked would stay. Passing Rosie's room, Alexander paused, whispering into the dark sleep well. "And thank you for singing your father's song again." In her sleep, Rosie smiled. And somewhere, Alexander was certain, Lily was smiling too. Chapter 6. The Media Storm. That morning, Boston was colder than usual. Fog draped the road leading to the Thorne estate, muting the world into shades of gray. But the quiet rhythm of the morning was gone. The sharp clicks of cameras, the shouting of reporters, loud, urgent, rolled through the black iron gates like waves crashing against a once still shore. In the kitchen, Emily was slicing fruit for breakfast when movement caught her eye. Through the window, she saw figures gathered outside the gate's lenses, glinting voices carrying. She froze, setting the knife down her pulse, thudding in her ears. The doorbell chimed over and over, each ring chased by shouted questions. "Emily Carter. Is it true you used to live in a truck, Mr. Thorne? What's your relationship with her? That little girl, is she your daughter?" Emily stepped back from the window, feeling the safe walls of the house shrink inward. Rosie ran in, wrapping her arms around her mother's leg. "Mommy, who's out there? Why are they yelling?" Emily knelt, gathering her close. "It's all right, sweetheart. Just some people asking questions." Her voice trembled anyway, and Rosie noticed. Footsteps approached from the hall. Alexander appeared, white shirt, gray vest, his expression sharp but steady. His eyes swept over them, the look alone a quiet promise. "Stay with me," he said, his voice firm enough to leave no room for argument. Emily hesitated, part fear of the chaos, part dread of being dragged into a public spectacle, but his gaze didn't ask. It told. He stepped out onto the front porch. The gates swung open and the press surged forward, cameras raised like weapons. "Mr. Thorne, there are rumors she's a gold digger. Care to comment? Is she living here? Is the child yours?" Alexander stopped just beyond the gates, spine-straight eyes sweeping the crowd. From the threshold, Emily watched him, an unmoving wall between her and the world. "She," Alexander began, his voice carrying without a microphone, "is the reason I know how to breathe again." The crowd stilled for a beat. She brought laughter back into this house. She reminded me what it feels like to love a child, and that loss isn't the end. If anyone dares to call her a gold digger, he met the nearest camera dead on. They can expect to hear from my lawyer. Emily felt something tremble deep in her chest. It wasn't just his words, it was that he'd laid his heart open to the public, no matter the cost. Rosie tugged on her sleeve and whispered, "He's protecting us, Mommy." Emily nodded, eyes blurring. Questions flew again, but Alexander's tone shifted. No longer the cool, distant CEO, he was a man unwilling to lose what mattered. "I won't answer questions that insult the people I care about," he said. Then he turned, closing the gates before anyone could push through. "If it were you standing in the shadow of someone willing to defend you before the whole world, would you feel afraid of the spotlight? Or proud to be chosen openly?" When the gates clanged shut, the noise outside dulled, but the echo still throbbed in Emily's chest. She stood on the porch as Alexander approached. He said nothing at first. Then a few steps away, he slipped off his jacket and settled it over her trembling shoulders. "No one gets to make you feel unsafe in your own home," he said, voice tight but warm. Rosie watched wide-eyed, still piecing it together. Alexander crouched, resting a steady hand on her shoulder. "It's all right, Rosie. Just some people who don't know how to ask nicely." She nodded but clung to Emily's arm. Emily smoothed her daughter's hair silently, storing away this image, Alexander speaking to Rosie with a voice soft enough to soothe. Inside, Emily settled Rosie at the kitchen table with a cup of warm milk. Alexander stood at the counter, silent for a moment before saying, "News travels fast. They won't let this go quickly." Emily looked up, worry still flickering in her eyes. "I'm not afraid of them asking about me. I'm afraid this will hurt you, your reputation. My reputation can't keep a dead heart alive." He cut in, gaze steady. "You and Rosie did." The breakfast on the table cooled untouched. Alexander sat across from her, fingers laced, speaking slowly. "I stood in front of them today because I wanted them to understand no one defines your worth but you." Her throat tightened. His words pressed against old wounds, years of whispers, judgment, and the silent cruelty of people who thought they knew her story. Rosie finished her milk and wandered into the living room, leaving them alone. "They won't stop here," Emily said quietly. "They'll dig, make things up, try to hurt us." "I know," he replied, "but if we let them divide us, we've already lost before we've begun." She studied him, then asked, "Why say, 'I'm the reason you can breathe again, in front of all those cameras?'" "Because it's true," he said simply. "Before you and Rosie, I was only existing, not living. Every day was just repetition, nothing to look forward to. Now, I wait for Rosie's footsteps running down the hall. I wait to see you look up when I walk into the room. And I wait for the chance to protect that." Her eyes stung. She turned away, fussing with the flowers on the table to hide the tear that fell. He didn't press her for a response. He only rose and walked toward the living room, reminding her without words that what he'd said wasn't just for her, but for the little girl too. By midday, Alexander took several calls from his legal team. Emily caught phrases like restraining order, defamation, and invasion of privacy. His voice was firm, leaving no doubt he meant to follow through. When he hung up, he told her, "You won't face them alone. Whatever happens, I'll be there." If you were faced with a crowd ready to tear down someone you loved, would you stay silent to avoid trouble, or step forward to shield them, knowing you'd become the target too? By afternoon, the morning's confrontation was everywhere online. Some comments were harsh, but others defended them. Rare to see a CEO say that in public. "Look at the way he looks at her. You can't fake that." Emily read a few, her heart beating somewhere between fear and warmth. Not everyone believed the worst. And more importantly, Alexander had made the ones who did think twice. That night, after Rosie was asleep, Emily found him on the back porch, gazing out at the garden where the lavender shimmered under the lights. She stepped up beside him, her voice low. "I've never had anyone defend me like that before." He didn't turn, but his reply was certain. "Get used to it. I'm not stopping." Through the dark, Emily smiled, knowing the day's storm had pulled them closer, not just as people sharing a home, but as two who had chosen fully to stand on the same side no matter the weather. Beyond the gates, the reporters had thinned only a few camera flashes flickering in the fog. Inside, the fire in the hearth cast its glow over both their faces as they sat in quiet. No elaborate promises, no dramatic vows, just the solid presence beside her. And in that, Emily knew she'd found a place to breathe, and a man who wouldn't let her stand alone against the world. Chapter 7. Pine Cone Bunny. That night the Thorne estate rested in a rare kind of quiet. No wind howling through the eaves, no rain lashing the windows like the night before. No alarms, no camera shutters clicking beyond the gates. The fire still burned, casting rippling light across the walls as if the whole house had slowed its breathing. Emily sat on the long couch, folding the last of a laundry basket. Upstairs, Rosie was fast asleep, one small hand clutching her cloth doll. From the hallway, Alexander appeared, his steps steady, but not weighed down the way they so often were. In his hand, he carried something. He stopped a few paces from her and looked down at it. A hardcover book, its edges worn soft, the pages yellowed with years of turning. On the cover, a little bunny wearing a hat made from a pine cone. Pine Cone Bunny. Emily glanced up, curiosity in her eyes. Alexander drew in a slow breath before offering it to her. "Lily loved this book," he said, his voice low but steady. "She made me read it every night, even when she could recite every word herself." Emily took it with both hands as though it might break. Her fingers traced the cover, and for a moment she swore it still carried the warmth of a child's embrace. "This must mean a lot to you," she murmured. He nodded once. "So much. I haven't handed it to anyone since the day I lost her." His gaze met hers, steady and deliberate. "But tonight I want you to keep it. Not because you're replacing Lily." His voice softened, "but because you're not. You're you." Her throat tightened. She had feared quietly and often that he only saw her as a shadow of what he'd lost. "Thank you," she whispered. I don't know what to say." "You don't have to," Alexander replied. "Just keep being here, the way you are now." They sat together, the book resting between them. Alexander opened to the first page. In pink crayon in the messy hand of a child, it read, "To Daddy, from Lily." Emily's smile trembled as she brushed her fingers lightly over the words. "Do you want to read it?" she asked gently. He hesitated, then nodded. "Yes, but this time, I'll read it for Rosie too." Upstairs, Rosie was still sleeping, her hair spilling across the pillow. Alexander sat at the edge of her bed and began, his voice deep and warm in the dim light. "Once upon a time, there was a little bunny who wore a hat made from a pine cone." Rosie stirred, blinking drowsily. "Mommy?" "Who's reading?" Emily leaned close. "He's reading you a very special story." Rosie listened for a few lines, then smiled, curling back into her blankets. Alexander read every word, slow, unhurried, never skipping a line. By the time he closed the book, Rosie was deeply asleep, her lips curved into the faintest smile. From the doorway, Emily realized Alexander wasn't just reading to Rosie. He was reading to himself, reminding his heart that loving someone new doesn't erase the love you've lost. It makes room for more. Do you believe that giving someone a keepsake from someone you've lost means you trust them with a piece of your heart? If you've ever been given such a gift, how did it feel? Back downstairs, Emily still held the book, its cover warm from the firelight and from the story just told. Alexander motioned to the seat near the hearth. "Sit. I want to tell you why this book matters so much." She settled in, hugging it to her chest. The firelight caught in her eyes, reflecting back as though ready to hold whatever truth he was about to share. When Lily turned 4, Alexander began leaning forward. "I bought it from a little bookstore, not because of the cover, but because she pointed to it and said, 'Daddy, this bunny's hat looks like the one we found in the park.'" A faint laugh escaped him, though there was a fracture in it. "From then on, I had to read it every night. If I read too fast, she'd make me start over slower. If I skipped a sentence, she'd catch me." It went on like that, until the very last night. Emily stayed quiet, letting him finish. After the accident, I locked it away in a drawer. I thought, if I didn't see it, I could forget the sound of her laugh. But the truth is, I didn't forget. I just forgot how to laugh back. He lifted his gaze, eyes clear and unflinching. Then you and Rosie came, and she laughed the way I thought I'd never hear again. Tonight, seeing you both by the fire, I knew this book shouldn't be locked away anymore. Emily swallowed her chest, both heavy and light at once. You trust me? With a piece of Lily? No, he said softly, shaking his head. I trust you. With a piece of me. The words made her look away, blinking back the warmth that stung her eyes. Alexander reached out, resting his hand on the book in her lap. Keep it, not to replace anyone. Keep it. To remember that love isn't measured by how many people you've lost, but by how many you dare to love again. Emily nodded, as if stitching the words directly into her heart. Outside, snow began to fall, the flakes melting into droplets as they kissed the glass. Emily opened the book again, finding the page where the bunny stood under the rain. Maybe, she said quietly, someone out there is smiling, seeing this book back in the firelight. Alexander looked at her, and for the first time his eyes weren't anchored in the past. They were here in the present, full and unguarded. That night, Emily placed Pine Cone Bunny on the table beside her bed, not as a relic from someone else's life, but as a thread binding 3 hearts under the same roof. Rosie slept soundly down the hall, and in the room across from hers, Alexander sat at his window watching the snow fall, knowing a new chapter of his life had begun, with that book resting just a few steps away. If you had something that once belonged to someone you loved and lost something you've never let anyone else hold, who would you give it to and why? Because sometimes giving it away doesn't mean losing it. It means letting the memory live on. Chapter 8. Daddy. The Boston sky that day looked like it had been draped in a silk cloth of pure blue, with clouds drifting lazily, as if they had nowhere else to be. In the back garden, the grass had just been trimmed, the scent of fresh green mixing with the faint lavender from the rows of flowers along the fence. On the lawn, a red and white checkered picnic blanket was spread out, laden with sandwiches, fruit, and a pitcher of cool lemonade. Rosie ran barefoot through the grass in a pale yellow dress, her small feet brushing the cool blades. Emily sat on the blanket, golden hair catching the sunlight, her eyes following her daughter's every move. Alexander lounged a few feet away, one hand propped behind him, the other holding a glass of lemonade. His expression was softer than usual, as though the afternoon had stripped away every layer of armor he normally carried. Rosie darted after a small white butterfly, her laughter ringing across the garden. Careful, Rosie, Emily called, but the little girl was too caught up in her chase. Near the stone path, the butterfly swooped low, and Rosie lunged after it. She slipped. The sound of the fall was small, but her cry was immediate. Before Emily could even rise, Alexander was already moving his glass, abandoned his strides long. He dropped to one knee beside her. Hey, it's okay, sweetheart. I got you. Rosie hiccuped through her tears, and then between sobs a single word left her lips, a word that froze time. Daddy. Emily stopped mid-step, her heart stuttering in her chest. Alexander went still too. That word hadn't been prompted. No one had told her to say it. It came naturally, instinctively, like it had been there all along. Rosie's little arms wrapped around his neck, her face pressed into his shoulder. Alexander held her tightly, one hand shielding the scrape on her knee, the other wrapped firmly around her back, as though letting go might cost him the most precious thing in the world. Emily knelt beside them. She saw Alexander's eyes, wet, unhidden. He didn't sob, but silent tears slipped down, vanishing into Rosie's soft hair. When his gaze met hers, no words were needed. She understood this was his moment. Not to replace someone he'd lost, but to step fully willingly into something new. Alexander drew a deep breath and gave a small nod, half a promise, half a declaration. I'm here, Rosie. Always. His arms tightened around her, sealing the words into both their heartbeats. Emily placed a hand on his shoulder, feeling the strength there. For the first time in a long time, she felt safe. Truly safe. If it were you, If a child called you mom or dad for the first time, would you hesitate, unsure? Or hold on tight and say, "Yes, I'm here"? Rosie stayed curled in Alexander's arms, her sobs softening. From his pocket, he pulled out a handkerchief and gently dabbed at her knee, then brushed away her tears. "See, just a tiny scrape. You'll be all better in a few days." Rosie sniffled, her blue eyes still shining with tears. "But it hurts." Alexander leaned down and kissed her knee softly. "Daddy's kiss makes it better." Emily opened the small first aid kit she'd brought and watched as Alexander carefully placed a cartoon bandage over the scrape. Something stirred deep in her chest, warmth and a tremor of fear, because she knew she was witnessing something that couldn't be faked. Rosie looked at the bandage and smiled. "I like it." "Thank you, Daddy." Alexander paused for a heartbeat, then smiled back. "Anything for you, sweetheart." Back at the picnic blanket, Rosie sat between them, munching on watermelon and retelling her battle with the butterfly like it had been a grand adventure. Alexander listened intently, never taking his eyes off her, as if every word was a rare treasure. Emily recognized that look. Once it had belonged to a father who had lost his child. Now, it was slowly becoming the gaze of a father raising one. When they finished eating, Rosie darted to the far end of the garden where an old wooden swing hung beneath a willow tree. Alexander followed, holding the rope steady as she climbed on. "Ready?" he asked. "Ready!" she squealed. With each push, her laughter rose higher, brighter. Emily stood a little distance away, shading her eyes from the sun, but keeping her heart wide open to take in the sight. When the swing slowed, Rosie leaned back, face turned to the sky, and shouted, "I love you, Daddy." Alexander froze for a second, his grip tightening on the ropes as his heart clenched, then expanded in the same breath. He wrapped his arms around her from behind and whispered, "Daddy loves you too." From across the garden, Emily bit her lip, tears stinging her eyes. By the time they returned to the blanket, the sun was low, bathing the garden in honey gold light. Alexander lay on his side, propped on one elbow, while Rosie rested her head on his other arm, chattering about the butterfly castle she planned to build. Emily packed up the basket, but her gaze never left them. She knew today a new thread had been tied, strong, unbreakable, between Rosie and Alexander. Do you think parental love requires blood to be real? Or can it grow anywhere there's a heart willing to protect, nurture, and love? The garden lights flickered on as the sky deepened, catching on the first drops of evening dew. Rosie was half asleep against Alexander's shoulder as they walked inside. He carried her upstairs, laying her gently in bed, and lingered there, just watching her breathe. From the doorway, Emily whispered, "Thank you," for accepting her. Alexander turned his smile, rare but certain. "If I hadn't, I would have lost the most precious thing I've ever been given the chance to find again." The door closed softly, but inside that house, a new family had been formed, not on paper, but in the hearts of all three. Chapter 9. Purple Orchids. That morning, Boston woke to a rare gift, a soft golden sun in the middle of winter. Light streamed through the dining room windows, spilling into thin ribbons across the polished wooden floor. Emily came down the stairs, running her fingers through damp hair still warm from her shower. She stopped at the doorway. In the center of the table, where the usual white ceramic vase of lavender should have been, stood a tall crystal vase. Inside it, stems of deep purple orchids rose gracefully, their silk-like petals catching the early light, glowing as if lit from within. There was no card, no note, only the blooms themselves, standing tall and quietly alive. Emily stepped closer, brushing a fingertip along one petal. The softness made her chest tighten. She remembered Alexander's voice just days ago, telling her about Lily's drawings, the ones filled with simple, childlike purple flowers. Purple orchids. She remembered exactly what he had said. Lily loved them more than any other flower. Her teeth pressed lightly into her bottom lip. This bouquet wasn't just a gesture, it was a reminder. And maybe a promise. One he didn't have to put into words. Rosie tumbled into the room, her blonde hair a sleepy tangle. "Mom, These are so pretty, she squealed, leaning in to take a big sniff. They smell like morning sunshine. Emily laughed softly, though her eyes burned. Yes, they do, she said, smoothing her daughter's hair while her gaze stayed fixed on the flowers. Footsteps sounded in the hall, steady, familiar. Alexander walked in crisp white shirt, coffee in hand. His eyes skimmed over the vase briefly before finding Emily's face. Something unspoken passed between them in that quiet. Emily's voice was soft. They're beautiful. He nodded once. They last a long time, if you take care of them. It was an ordinary sentence, but Emily heard something layered beneath it. Not just about flowers, not just about memory, but about a connection, one that, if tended together, could endure. They sat for breakfast. Rosie busied herself with pancakes while Emily's eyes drifted back to the vase again and again. Sunlight poured over the orchids, turning their violet hue into something almost luminous. And right then, Emily realized she wasn't a guest anymore. She was part of the story here. Part of a home where purple orchids were no longer only for someone who was gone, but also for someone who had stayed. If it were, would you believe in an unspoken promise? A gesture, a gift, a quiet presence, no words attached yet. You knew exactly what it meant. I'm here and I'll stay. After breakfast, Rosie ran out to the garden, leaving Emily and Alexander across from each other in the sunlit room. Emily traced her finger along the rim of her mug before asking, "Have you ever given purple orchids?" To anyone other than Lily. Alexander's eyes held hers for a long beat. No. He didn't explain. He didn't need to. The silence said everything. She didn't say thank you. It didn't feel big enough for what he'd just given her. Instead, she stood and walked to the vase, turning it slightly so the blooms faced more toward the light. Alexander watched her. He noticed she tended to flowers the way she tended to Rosie, carefully, patiently, with a love that left nothing half done. In his memory, Lily's voice echoed, "Daddy, purple orchids are like good friends. If you take care of them with your heart, they'll stay a long time." And now, watching Emily, he realized maybe she was teaching him the same thing. How to care for something with his heart, so it would stay. At noon, Emily took a single orchid stem into the kitchen, placing it in the small ceramic vase Rosie once used for wildflowers. Rosie tilted her head. "Why is this one in here, Mommy?" Because Emily smiled. "I wanted it in the place we're in the most, so every time we see it, we remember beautiful things will stay if we treasure them." That evening, Alexander came home to find Rosie proudly showing off the single orchid. "This one's from Daddy," she said. "Mom says it's going to stay here forever." He stopped in the doorway, the words "stay here forever" looping in his mind like a promise he'd never dared to say out loud, but now found himself wanting to keep. Later that night, after Rosie was asleep, Emily came into the living room. The tall vase of orchids still stood on the table, but now there was something beside it, a small crystal jar. Inside, folded neatly, was a slip of paper. 4 handwritten words, "For our future." Emily held the paper in her hands, her heart stirring in a way no words could quite describe. Have you ever been given something small that made you believe in the future? Not because of its price, but because of the message hidden inside. Outside, the full moon cast silver light across the garden over the lavender rose and the bench where they'd once sat together. Emily placed the note back into the crystal jar and whispered, "I'll believe, if you keep your word." Upstairs, Alexander stood on the balcony looking down at the dining room. He saw her sitting there bathed in soft light beside the vase of purple orchids, and he knew whatever promise he had just made, he would keep it. Not only for Lily, but for Emily and for Rosie. Chapter 10. We're home. The late afternoon rain had just passed, leaving the garden steeped in the earthy scent of damp soil laced with the faint sweetness of lavender. Raindrops clung to the purple orchids, trembling with each passing breeze. Above the thorn estate, the Boston sky opened into a pale wash of blue, and the last light of the day spilled down like a thin silk scarf over the wet garden. Emily walked slowly along the rain-slick stone path, brushing her fingertips through the knee-high lavender. Alexander kept pace beside her, unhurried, the dark leather of his shoes, leaving faint impressions in the grass. His hand was laced with hers, so naturally it felt as if it had belonged there for years, only now finally claiming its place. Ahead, Rosie bounded through the yard in her rubber boots, sending a spray of droplets into the air. Her golden hair glittered under the sun arms flung wide, as if she could hug the whole garden at once. Her laughter mingled with the birdsong that had returned after the storm. Emily paused, glanced sideways at Alexander and whispered, "We're home, aren't we?" He turned to her, his eyes never leaving her face. His voice was low, steady. "Yes, we finally are." The words weren't only for her. They closed the chapter on years he had spent wandering the halls of his own house, each room a half-finished memory. They opened the door to something new, a life where he was no longer standing on the outside of other people's happiness. Emily squeezed his hand, feeling a warmth there that outshone the fading sunlight. They reached the trellis at the far end of the garden, where Rosie was trying to jump high enough to touch the droplets clinging to the vines. Alexander bent down, lifting her easily, and their laughter carried across the yard. Emily stepped back a little, taking in the sight. It was a picture she knew she would carry forever. When Rosie was set down, she ran to Emily and wrapped her small arms around her mother's waist. "Mommy, this is our home, right?" Emily crouched, hugging her daughter and glancing at Alexander. He gave the smallest nod, his eyes full of a feeling only those who have lost and found again could truly understand. "That's right, sweetheart," Emily said softly. "Our home." They settled onto the wooden bench under the willow tree. Alexander's arm rested along Emily's shoulders, Rosie tucked snugly between them, chattering about her raindrop hunting adventure. A breeze drifted through, carrying the scent of fresh grass and a soft rustle like music, written just for this moment. Emily leaned her head against Alexander's shoulder, listening to his heartbeat, steady, sure. And somewhere inside she realized she could no longer hear the echo of loneliness. If you had spent years belonging nowhere, how would it feel for someone to hold your hand and say, "We're home now"? Would it be joy, fear, or the quiet relief of finally setting down your bags? Rosie slipped off the bench, splashing into a shallow puddle on the path. "Careful," Emily called, laughing. "You'll soak your clothes and catch a cold." Alexander didn't move, only watched her with a quiet smile. "She's like you," he murmured. "Not afraid of getting dirty, not afraid of getting wet, only afraid of missing the fun." Emily turned to him, the warmth in her chest tinged with a shy sort of ache. Rosie came back holding a fallen sprig of lavender. She climbed onto the bench and placed it into Alexander's palm. "For Daddy. So you remember today?" He looked at the tiny flower, then at Rosie, closing his hand slowly as if tucking away a treasure. "Daddy will remember. Always." Emily heard the slight tremor in his voice, and her own heart moved with it. The breeze stirred again, shaking the raindrops from the nearby orchids, scattering the sunlight into 100 small sparks. Emily thought if anyone asked her what home was, she'd take them to this moment. A garden after rain, a child's laughter, and the steady grip of a hand that wouldn't let go. Alexander spoke suddenly. "When Lily died, I thought I'd never hear a child call me Daddy again. Until Rosie did it on her own without anyone telling her to." He looked at Emily. "You didn't just bring Rosie into my life. You brought home back to me." Emily wanted to answer, but her throat closed up. Instead, she only tightened her grip on his hand, letting that be the reply. The sky shifted into honeyed gold as evening approached. Rosie ran until she was breathless, then climbed into Alexander's lap, resting her head on his chest. Tired, she mumbled, still smiling. Alexander glanced at Emily over Rosie's head, and in that shared space between them he repeated, "We're home now." This time it wasn't a statement, it was a vow. Emily's eyes shimmered. "And we'll stay, always." The grandfather clock inside chimed for dinner. Alexander carried Rosie toward the house, Emily walking beside him, his hand still linked with hers. They stepped over the threshold of the Thorne estate, and for the first time it wasn't a border between cold and warmth. It was simply the way home. Have you found your home yet? Not an address, but a place with someone who makes you want to return every day? If yes, tell your story. If not, give yourself the chance to find it. Sometimes home is just a hand you choose to hold. That night they ate at the long wooden table, conversation and laughter filling the space between bites. Rosie told the tale of her dancing raindrops, Emily's laughter spilling out in soft bursts. Alexander didn't need to say much. He just listened and felt the once empty corners of the house filling up with voices, with presence, with life. Later, when Rosie was asleep, Alexander and Emily sat together by the fire. No plans, no grand promises, just the quiet agreement that no matter what tomorrow brought, they would keep choosing to stay. A few months later, the Thorne estate was no longer the same. The once silent hallways now echoed with the patter of Rosie's small footsteps every morning. The kitchen, once scented only with solitary coffee, now carried the smell of warm pancakes layered with laughter and the gentle clinking of spoons and forks. The tall windows no longer opened just to let the light in. They now welcomed sunlight that spilled across faces gathered together at the table. Emily had gone back to nursing school, her notebooks faintly scented with early morning coffee and edged with little handwritten notes of encouragement from Alexander. Rosie, with her box of crayons and a stack of paper, had created a large drawing, 3 people holding hands under a bright blue sky, the word family scrawled above in the shaky lines of a child's hand. Alexander framed it and hung it in the living room, right where anyone could see it. Out in the garden, the purple orchids bloomed in full under Alexander's careful tending. One quiet afternoon, he bent down, brushed a petal with his fingertips, and whispered, "Hi, Lily. We're home now." The words dissolved into the breeze, but inside him they closed one chapter of grief and opened another one filled with peace, love, and the choice to stay. Do you believe that family isn't only something you're born into, but also something you choose? Share a moment when someone chose to stay by your side, even when they could have walked away. If this story made you smile or brought tears to your eyes, leave a rating from 1 to 10 for this journey. Follow and turn on the bell so you won't miss the next healing story, because who knows, the next one might just be yours.